There are men who build walls so high that even they forget what they buried on the other side. Duke James Harlow was one of those men. He was 25 years old, master of Harlow Castle in the county of Derbyshire, England, and he had not smiled, genuinely smiled, in 3 years. The staff knew this. The tenants on his land knew this. The whole of the English countryside seemed to know this, the way countryside always knows the private temperature of the great houses that sit inside it. What nobody knew was why. Stay with this story. Because the answer walked through the front gates of Harlow Castle on a gray October morning, wearing a bright dress and carrying nothing but a leather music case and a talent that would crack this man open like cold stone in a winter frost. Harlow Castle stood on a long rise above the Derbyshire Valley, surrounded by moorland that turned purple in summer and iron gray in autumn. It had 41 rooms, a library that held more books than some small towns, a grand staircase of pale marble, and a dining hall with a ceiling so high that candlelight never quite reached the top of it. It was magnificent. It was immaculate. It felt like no one lived there. James Harlow had inherited the estate at 22, 3 years prior, when his father, Lord Edmund Harlow, died of a sudden illness that gave no warning and no time for goodbyes. Edmund had been more than a father. He had been the warmth at the center of this house, the laughter in the library, the voice that carried through the corridors on Sunday mornings, the man who taught James to ride, to think, to feel that the world was worth the effort of being in it. When Edmund died, something in James went very quiet, not grief exactly, something past grief. Something that happens when a person loses the one presence that made them feel safe enough to be themselves, and decides, not consciously, not with words, that safety itself is the problem, that if you do not let anything matter too much, nothing can be taken from you again. He ran the estate with precision. He met his obligations. He was fair to his tenants, correct with his peers, and utterly, completely unreachable by anyone who tried to get close. His housekeeper, Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, a stout and practical woman of 60 who had served the Harlow family for 30 years, watched all of this with the specific sorrow of someone who remembers what the house used to sound like and cannot stop comparing. It used to sound like music, she would say, to no one in particular. Lord Edmund always kept a musician at the estate. James had not until this autumn. The decision to hire a pianist came not from sentiment but from obligation. Lord Ashford Crane was coming to Harlow Castle. Crane was 58, enormously wealthy, and controlled a network of land agreements across 3 counties that James needed access to if he was going to expand the estate's operations in the north. The dinner Crane expected would need to be impressive, correct? The kind of evening that communicated, without stating it directly, that Harlow Castle was a house of culture and refinement and absolutely not a cold shell occupied by a young man who had forgotten how to be present in his own life. James sent a letter to a music academy in London. He was specific in his requirements. He needed a pianist, skilled, unobtrusive, someone who would provide appropriate background during the dinner service and not draw attention to themselves. The letter used the word discreet twice. The academy sent Eleanor Voss. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of October. James watched her from the upper window of his study as the coach came through the gates. He had not intended to watch. He had been standing at the window reading correspondence, and the movement in the courtyard below simply caught his eye the way movement catches the eye, without permission, without announcement. She stepped down from the coach and looked up at the castle. Not with nerves, not with the careful, contained expression of a young woman arriving at a great house and remembering her place in it. She looked up at Harlow Castle the way you look at something large and interesting that you have not yet decided what to make of. Her hair was dark, pinned up but slightly loose at the sides from the journey. She wore a bright cobalt blue dress, not a servant's dress, not a performer's plain black, but a proper dress with a wide skirt that moved in the October wind, and she carried a leather music case in one hand. And nothing else. James looked away. Back to his correspondence. He did not think about her again until dinner, Mrs. Whitmore showed Eleanor to a modest room in the east wing and delivered on James's behalf a folded note containing the evening's requirements. Eleanor read it at the small writing desk by the window, the autumn moorland gray and wide behind the glass. The note was precise. She would play during the dinner service on Friday evening. She would use the approved list of compositions enclosed. Handel, a selection of Bach, 2 pieces by an English composer James apparently favored. She would not engage guests in conversation unless directly addressed. She would not leave the piano until the dinner concluded. She would be, the note said in its final line, a pleasant and unobtrusive presence. Eleanor set the note down on the desk. She looked at the enclosed list of approved compositions. She looked out at the moorland. She looked back at the list, then she folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of the desk, not in defiance, not yet. Simply because something about the word unobtrusive had landed in her chest in a way she needed a moment to sit with. She had heard that word before, worn it before, like a coat someone else chose for her. She had spent 4 years at the London Academy learning to play other people's music in other people's rooms with other people's rules governing exactly how much of herself she was permitted to bring into it. She was very good at it. The Academy had told her so, regularly, in the tone of people who consider technical proficiency the same thing as excellence. But she had started lately to suspect they were not the same thing at all. Friday evening arrived cold and clear. The dining hall at Harlow Castle looked magnificent by candlelight. The long table had been set with the Harlow silver and the crystal that only came out for significant guests. A fire burned at each end of the room. The portraits of James's ancestors lined the stone walls. Generations of Harlow, men all wearing the same composed, unyielding expression, as though the family had decided collectively, centuries ago, that visible feeling was a form of weakness. Eleanor sat at the piano in the corner of the room, a beautiful instrument, a Broadwood grand, clearly expensive and clearly rarely played, and watched the guests arrive. Lord Ashford Crane entered first. Heavy-set, expensive suit, the particular confidence of a man who has never once been told no and considers this a natural condition. He shook James's hand and looked around the room with the assessing eyes of a man calculating what everything was worth. And then James himself crossed the room toward the piano. Eleanor had not been formally introduced to him. She had received only his note and Mrs. Whitmore's quiet instructions. Now up close, she understood something about him that the note had not communicated. He was not cold the way cruel men are cold. He was cold the way a house is cold when the fire has not been lit in a very long time. There was something behind his eyes, something that had been put away carefully, locked up and covered over, that she caught for only a fraction of a second before his expression closed completely. He looked at her the way you look at a piece of furniture you have placed correctly in a room. "Miss Voss," he said, "you have the list." "I do," she said. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second, then he turned and walked back to his guests. Eleanor turned to face the Broadwood grand. She placed her hands on the keys. The approved list sat in the top drawer of her desk in the east wing. She had not brought it with her. The first note Eleanor played was not on the approved list. Everyone in that dining hall understood this within moments. Not because they were musicians, because the body knows before the mind catches up when something real has entered a room. The piece that came from that Broadwood grand was not Handel. It was not Bach. It was not the composed, careful, socially appropriate music that James Harlow had specified in his precise, twice-folded note. It was something else entirely. Something that moved through the candlelit room the way the October wind moved through the moorland outside. Low at first, almost beneath hearing, and then gradually, undeniably everywhere. Eleanor's hands were not following instructions. They were following something she had been carrying since she was 9 years old, sitting at her mother's piano in a small house in Somerset, playing music that her teacher would later tell her was too emotional, too unrestrained, too much. Tonight, for the first time in 4 years, she let it be too much. She was not thinking about Lord Crane. She was not thinking about the approved list sitting in the drawer upstairs. She was not even thinking about the consequences collecting quietly at the edges of this decision, the way storm clouds collect at the edges of the moors before anyone thinks to look up. She was thinking about James Harlow's eyes. That fraction of a second, the thing she had seen behind his expression before it closed. She had recognized it the way you recognize something you have felt yourself. Not because someone described it to you, but because your body carries the memory of it. That specific, careful blankness of a person who has decided that feeling things openly is no longer worth the cost. She had worn that same expression for 4 years in London. She knew exactly how heavy it was. And something in her, something that had no interest in being sensible or strategic or unobtrusive, had decided, in the 3 seconds between sitting down at the Broadwood and placing her hands on the keys, that she was going to play directly at that locked thing behind his eyes. Not for him, not as a gesture or a performance, simply because it was true, and true things need somewhere to go. The piece she played had no formal title. She had been composing it in fragments over the past 2 years, small sections written in the margins of academy notebooks, hummed quietly on the coach between engagements, developed in the hour before dawn when the London streets were still empty, and she had the practice. Room to herself, it had never been performed, it had never been heard by anyone, until now it began quietly, almost too quietly. The guests at the long table found themselves leaning almost imperceptibly forward without realizing they were doing it, straining toward the sound, the way you strain toward a voice speaking just below comfortable hearing. The melody that emerged was not complicated. It did not ask for effort or education. It asked only that you be a person who had ever lost something and kept moving anyway. And there was not a soul in that candlelit room who could not answer that particular question. It moved slowly at first with a low, searching quality, like someone walking through a house they grew up in and finding the rooms both familiar and strange. Then it gathered. It added texture and weight, building with a patience that made the building feel inevitable rather than constructed. And somewhere near the middle, it shifted into something that briefly, achingly resembled a lullaby, just a fragment, just 4 bars before it turned and went somewhere a lullaby had never been intended to go. At the far end of the table, Lady Miriam Ashford, Lord Crane's wife, 61 years old and not a woman given to public displays of anything, found her hand moving across the tablecloth toward her husband's without conscious decision. She did not look at him. She simply found his hand and held it. He did not pull away. He turned his palm upward and held hers back. Neither of them mentioned it afterward. That is what Eleanor was doing. She was playing the shape of the thing that lives underneath every life, the part that does not appear in polite conversation or approved lists or carefully constructed dinner evenings, the part that is simply stubbornly human. James Harlow had gone very still. He sat at the head of the long table with his wine glass untouched and his eyes fixed on Eleanor's back, on the line of her shoulders, the movement of her arms, the way her whole body participated in what her hands were doing, as though the music was not something being produced but something being released. His jaw was set. His expression was controlled. Anyone watching him would have seen a composed young lord sitting correctly at his own dinner table. But underneath the table, his right hand had closed into a fist against his thigh, because he knew this feeling. He knew it with his whole body, the way you know the particular quality of light in a room you grew up in. His father Edmund had played piano. Not professionally, not formally, just in the evenings in the library with the door half open, so the music drifted through the ground floor of the castle the way warmth drifts from a fire. Edmund never played from sheet music. He played the way Eleanor was playing now, following something internal, something honest, something that had no patience for the boundaries between what was felt and what was expressed. James had not heard music played like that since the night before his father died. He had not let himself hear it. He had built his approved lists and his precise notes and his requirement for unobtrusive specifically so that he would not have to sit in this room and feel what he was currently, against every careful construction, feeling his hand tightened against his thigh. He did not look away from her. If you have ever sat in a room where music found the exact thing you had been hiding from yourself, stay with this story, because what happens next between these two people nobody in that castle saw coming. Lord Crane had stopped eating. This was notable. Crane was a man who ate with the focused satisfaction of someone who considered a good meal one of life's reliable pleasures. He had arrived at this dinner with one primary interest, the land agreement he intended to negotiate with Harlow before the evening concluded, and he had expected everything else, including the music, to be pleasant background noise. He had not expected this. He sat back in his chair slowly, the way a man sits back when something has surprised him into a different posture. His assessing eyes, which had spent the first half of dinner cataloging the room's value, had moved to the piano and stayed there. He watched Eleanor's hands. He watched the movement of her shoulders. He watched the way the candlelight caught the cobalt blue of her dress as she played. Then he looked at James, and something passed across Crane's experienced, calculating face that he did not bother to conceal. A reassessment, not of the land agreement, of the young man sitting at the head of this table. A man who kept a musician like this at his estate was not the cold, purely transactional figure Crane had prepared to negotiate with. He was something more complicated, something more interesting, something, perhaps, more worth knowing than a single evening's business arrangement. Crane reached for his wine. James did not notice. James was still watching Eleanor. She played for 21 minutes. She did not track the time. She was somewhere inside the music, in the particular place where the edges of yourself dissolve, and there is only the thing you are doing and the truth you are doing it with. Her fingers ached slightly, her shoulders had gone warm from the sustained movement. She registered none of it. When she finally stopped, the silence was enormous. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of a room that has just been filled with something and is still adjusting to the shape of it. No one spoke 6 full seconds. Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the keys. She could not yet turn around. She needed those 6 seconds the way you need the moment after surfacing from deep water. Just to breathe, just to find the surface, just to remember where you are. Then a voice came from the head of the table, not Lord Crane, not Lady Miriam James. His voice was quiet, controlled, but there was something moving underneath it that control had not quite managed to cover. He said, "Miss Voss." Eleanor turned on the piano bench. She looked directly at him, across the full length of that long candlelit table, past the silver and the crystal and the watching faces of his guests. She looked directly at James Harlow. His expression was composed. His posture was correct. His dark eyes were completely unreadable. Except that they were not entirely, not anymore, he said. That was not on the list. Eleanor held his gaze without flinching. "No," she said. "It wasn't." The silence stretched between them like something pulled taut. Lord Crane made a sound low, almost amused, and reached for his wine again. James said nothing further. He looked at Eleanor for 3 more seconds. Then he looked down at the table. He reached for his own wine glass and lifted it slowly, and in the movement, in the precise, deliberate way he brought the glass to his lips, Eleanor saw something she had not expected. His hand was not entirely steady. Later that night, the castle went quiet room by room. Lord Crane retired first, pausing at the doorway to tell James with genuine warmth that this had been the finest evening he had spent in Derbyshire in years. The land agreement could wait until morning. Tonight deserved to simply be what it was. James stood at the entrance of the dining hall long after the last guest had gone. The candles had burned low. The fire at the far end of the room had settled to deep orange coals. The Broadwood Grand sat in the corner, lid still open, keys still exposed. He walked to it slowly. He stood in front of it for a long moment. Then he reached out and pressed one key. A single note. It rose in the empty room and faded slowly into the dark ceiling above. He stood there until it was completely gone. Then he heard footsteps in the corridor, soft, unhurried, and he stepped back from the piano and turned toward the door. And Eleanor was standing in the doorway in her cobalt blue dress with her music case in her hand and her dark hair still half loose from the evening. She had not expected him to be there. He had not expected her. They stood 12 feet apart in the dying candlelight of the dining hall, and neither of them spoke for a moment that lasted considerably longer than it should have. Then James said, in a voice he had not used in 3 years, not commanding, not composed, not the voice of a duke addressing a member of his household, but something quieter and considerably more dangerous. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him. Past the set jaw and the careful posture and the 3 years of constructed distance, she said, "The same place you learned to stop listening." James went absolutely still. She held his gaze for 1 more second. Then she turned and walked down the corridor, and her footsteps faded. And the castle was quiet again. But something in it had changed. Something that could not be put back the way it was. James Harlow did not sleep that night. He sat in the library until the fire burned down to nothing. A glass of brandy untouched on the side table beside him. A book open on his knee that he had not read a single word of. The room was dark except for the gray moonlight coming through the tall windows, laying long pale rectangles across the Persian rug. He kept hearing her voice. Not the music, the voice. Those 7 words spoken so quietly in the dying candlelight of the dining hall, with no cruelty in them and no performance. Just the particular directness of someone who has looked at a thing clearly and named it without flinching. "The same place you learned to stop listening." He closed the book, set it aside. Outside the library windows, the Derbyshire moorland stretched away in the moonlight, silver and vast and utterly still. His father had loved this view. Edmund Harlow used to stand at these exact windows on sleepless nights with a cup of tea going cold in his hand, looking out at the moors with the expression of a man who found the size of the world comforting rather than frightening. James had always found it frightening. He had never told anyone that. He stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the moorland his father loved, and for the first time in 3 years he let himself miss him, fully, without managing it. It moved through him like cold water through a crack in stone, finding every place the walls had thinned, every place the careful constructed distance had worn down to something almost transparent. He stood at the window for a long time. When he finally moved, he did not go to bed. He went to the dining hall. The Broadwood Grand sat in the corner exactly as Eleanor had left it. Lid open, keys exposed, one candle still burning on the mantelpiece across the room, low and wavering, throwing just enough light to see by. James sat down on the piano bench. He had not sat at a piano since his father's funeral. He placed his hands on the keys without pressing them, just rested them there, feeling the cool, smooth surface under his palms, the slight give of the keys under the weight of his fingers, not quite pressing, not quite releasing. His father had tried to teach him. James had been a poor student not from lack of ability, but from impatience. He had wanted to play well immediately and had no interest in the slow work of becoming. Edmund had laughed at this gently, without mockery, and told him that everything worth having required the humility of being bad at it first. James pressed one key. The same note he had pressed earlier. It rose in the empty room and hung in the air, clean and solitary, and then faded. He pressed another. Then another, not a melody, not anything recognizable. Just notes, one after another, in the silence of the castle at 2 in the morning, feeling his way towards something he could not name. He did not hear Eleanor come in. He only knew she was there when the candlelight shifted, the faint movement of air from the doorway causing the flame to lean sideways, and he looked up, and she was standing just inside the room in a deep rose dressing gown, dark hair loose around her shoulders, holding a single candle of her own. They looked at each other across the dark room. James did not move his hands from the keys. "I woke you," he said. "No," she said, "I wasn't sleeping either." She walked to the piano slowly, not with hesitation, with the care of someone moving through a space that has become, in some quiet way, significant. She stopped a few feet away and looked at his hands on the keys. "Your father played," she said. It was not a question. James looked down at the keys. "Every evening in the library. He never used sheet music." He paused. He said sheet music was someone else's conversation. He wanted to have his own. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down on the bench beside him, not close enough to be improper, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence in the cold room. The candle she had carried cast a small circle of gold light around them both, and outside that circle the dining hall was all deep shadow and moorland moonlight through the tall windows. "Play something," she said quietly. "I don't know how," James said. "Yes, you do," she said. "You were playing when I walked in. That wasn't playing, that was pressing keys." "That is how it starts," she said. "Every time." He looked at her. In the candlelight, her face was open and still and completely without pretense. No performance in it, no strategy. Just a young woman sitting beside him in the middle of the night in his cold castle, asking him to do something true. He turned back to the keys. He began to press them, slowly, one at a time at first, then two together. Then something that was almost, not quite, but almost, a phrase. It was hesitant and uneven and nothing like music in any formal sense. But Eleanor did not correct him. She did not offer instruction or guidance, or the kind of helpful interference that would have reminded him of his inadequacy. She simply sat beside him and listened as though what he was producing was worth listening to, and something in that, something in being heard without being assessed, unlocked a door in James Harlow that he had not known was still there to be. Opened. He played for perhaps 10 minutes, stumbling, searching, occasionally finding something that felt almost like intention before losing it. Again. When he stopped, the silence was different from the silence after Eleanor's performance earlier that evening. That silence had been full, dense with everything the music had said. This silence was empty in a softer way, like a room after rain, cleaned out, ready for something. "Why did you come here?" James asked. "Not to the room. To her you hired me," Eleanor said. "That is not what I mean." She looked at the keys for a moment. "The academy was going to offer me a teaching position," she said. "Permanent, secure, a room in the faculty building, and a salary and 30 years of teaching other people's children to play correctly." She paused. "I left before they could offer it." "Why?" She turned to look at him. "Because I would have said yes. And I knew if I said yes, I would never play the way I actually play. I would spend the rest of my life teaching people to stay inside lines I had already decided were too small." James held her gaze. "That is a considerable risk." "Yes," she said simply, "it is." The candle between them had burned down considerably. The light it threw was smaller now, closer, and in that smaller circle of light, the 12 feet of careful distance that had existed between them all evening had somehow reduced to nothing, without either of them making a conscious decision about it. James said, "What you said to me tonight." "In the corridor." Eleanor waited. "You were right," he said. The words came out with the specific quality of words that have been held for a long time and are only now being permitted to exist outside the body. I did stop listening after my father died. He stopped, began again. I made the house very quiet. I made everything very quiet. I thought that was how you kept things from hurting. Eleanor said nothing. She simply looked at him with those steady, clear eyes. It doesn't work, James said. I should tell you that, in case you were considering it as a strategy. There was something at the edge of those words, the ghost of a wryness, the very distant outline of the man Edmund Harlow had been raising before grief interrupted the project. Eleanor's mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something that could become one. I know, she said. I tried it for 4 years in London. They sat at the Broadwood Grand until the single candle burned out completely. In the darkness that followed, they did not move apart. They sat in the moonlight coming through the tall windows, close enough that his shoulder was almost touching hers, and outside the moorland lay silver and enormous and completely indifferent to the two young people sitting inside the castle, discovering, with some combination of relief and something considerably more alarming, that they were no longer strangers. James said, "At some point in the darkness, play something." Eleanor placed her hands on the keys. She played quietly, very quietly, so that the music stayed inside the small space of moonlight around them and did not fill the room. Something slow and searching and new, because every time she sat at this particular piano, something new came, as though the instrument itself was responding to the specific combination of people present. James sat beside her and listened, not with his arms folded, not with his jaw set and his expression managed and his careful distance maintained. He listened the way his father had listened, the way Edmund Harlow had stood at the library windows and looked at the moorland, with his whole self present, without protection, without calculation. When Eleanor finished, he did not speak immediately. Then he said very quietly again. She looked at him. His dark eyes in the moonlight held something that had not been in them at dinner. Something that had not been in them, Mrs. Whitmore would later say, in 3 years. Something that looked, if you knew what you were looking for, remarkably like a man remembering that the world is worth the effort of being in it. Eleanor turned back to the piano. She began to play again, and in the long, pale moonlight of the Derbyshire night, with the moors stretching silver and wide beyond the glass, James Harlow leaned forward almost imperceptibly, just a fraction, just enough, and closed his eyes. Outside the castle walls, the autumn wind moved through the moorland grass in long, slow waves, the kind of wind that does not hurry, the kind that has all the time in the world.